Well, 2024 has been an immensely interesting year for Destiny and Bungie, and in many ways a lot has happened this year, really, when you think about it. At the start of 2024, we were in Season of the Wish, which was an interesting time in itself for the game. Then coming out of that, Bungie had a rebuilding trust phase for Destiny 2 once again, which of course did lead to Into the Light, some of the best content that we've had this year in a lot of ways, but also of course the launch year for one of Destiny's biggest expansions. And despite difficulties that the game and the studio have faced over the past few months, the final shape was largely pretty successful, at least in the community. But beyond that, of course, there's been an entirely new content model for the game. Various dramas and scandals, as some people would probably refer to them. So we're going to recap 2024, which will give us some perspective, I suppose, as we look into 2025 for Destiny. And before we landed in 2024, there was a pretty pivotal moment for Destiny and Bungie, just ahead of the launch of Season of the Wish, which of course was Bungie's first round of layoffs late in 2023. Player sentiment around the game certainly was varied in that year, the Lightfall year, but when news broke about the layoffs, of course, it was a big tipping point, or another tipping point, for many players in the community. And I remember when Season of the Wish dropped, despite having new content, the vibes around the game just weren't great. But Bungie recognized this to an extent, partially because they knew Final Shape was on the horizon. That had also been delayed. And so if they wanted the expansion to be a success, it was a case of paving a more positive roadmap for the future of the game. So in the time when Rhythm's wishes were dropping, which were an end-of-season pursuit similar to something actually that we're going to see at the end of Revenant, Bungie began to talk about March updates to various weapons, where they actually introduced new weapons as part of a non-DLC. For core playlists like Trials, we had the Prophet, Tusk of the Boar dropping from Iron Banner, and of course weapons like the Slammer. So I guess that was an early gesture from Bungie really. And between those additions and things like Guardian Games bringing the first skimmer into Destiny 2, there was just enough of interest there to keep hardcore and engaged players coming back. And then Bungie announced Into the Light, one of the biggest free updates that we've ever had for any Destiny title, which saw the introduction of Onslaught. Finally, there was a Horde mode for Destiny, but also players were intrigued by the reprisal of a bunch of weapons. And this is curious because of course we complain lots about reprised weapons, but Bungie really decided to bring the gold this time with weapons like Hammerhead, Forbearance, Blast Furnace, Midnight Coup, and Luna's Howl, which indeed had their shiny variants. Then there was the Hall of Champions, reprised exotic missions, and additions like Pantheon and the PvP map pack that would drop later on during that update. And I think it's safe to say Bungie managed to win back a lot of players during this period of time. Of course, there'll be some players that never really returned until the final shape, understandably, but this was Bungie's big indication that they meant business in terms of updating and adding new content to the game. Around this time, they also start to preview the final shape in a lot more detail. That was when we learned about Prismatic. We started to get gameplay for it, but also a better look at the Pale Heart, the announcement of exotic class items. So relatively speaking, these are pretty exciting components on paper, and really this is how Bungie sold the final shape to us, given the year that we'd had after Lightfall. It was an intelligent strategy from Bungie. No doubt it also cost them a lot of resources, but there was an awareness that this was going to be critical to the success of the final shape. And like I say, these were Bungie's wins in 2024. The biggest one being the final shape itself, in my opinion. And I think, looking at player numbers at the time, general sentiment around the game, in that way, final shape was a significant success. The story was relatively well received, so was the destination, a lot of the rewards, especially the exotic pursuits. The main drama with final shape, really, were the exotic class items, right? This was something that Bungie had sold a lot of players on. And there was a lot of disappointment around the fact that these were not going to be easy to acquire for solo players. And that was probably the biggest drama with the final shape. And since then, Bungie have offered players other ways to get them, at least in isolation, through Festival of the Lost. Either way, as we look through the course of 2024, Final Shape was a big win. And then we got the episodes. Now, I remember Bungie dropping the video about episodes a few days after Final Shape had come out. And we were straight into Echoes, which, let's be real, Echoes was carried, especially in the first act, right? It was carried by the fact that it had dropped alongside a very good expansion. So there was a lot of new content in the game to play. And Echoes also did some things pretty well. Some of the activity content was good. and Bungie had touted the fact that episodes would continue to improve through the year. But in the first part of Echoes, players felt generally reasonably happy with the game. And I guess before Echoes had really started to show its age, there were a few other big bits of news related to Destiny, and something which probably caught quite a few players off guard, given that the game was at least more enjoyable to play at the time. But it was at the end of July when Bungie revealed that there were additional layoffs occurring in the company. And naturally, there was a lot of anger towards Pete Parsons, who'd actually made the announcement this time around, although it was slightly more of a lukewarm response versus the first round of layoffs, probably because players had sort of come to expect that this was a possibility, right? That was something that I had in the back of my mind. If Bungie really are struggling, obviously Final Shape is a really important product that they still need to get out. So it kind of stood to reason, really, that once that product was finished, something like this might happen again. A lot of the anger this time was directed directly towards Pete Parsons. He's not someone who is viewed very favorably within the Destiny player base. Very shortly after that, though, we landed at the 10th anniversary for Destiny. This was the one where Bungie confusingly showed the Guardian holding Icebreaker on the 10th anniversary announcement, only to confirm it would later drop in October with the second episode, Revenant. Either way, we got a 10-year anniversary armor set inspired by the early D1 box art Guardians, with a very short pursuit to actually collect that stuff. I think players had hoped for something perhaps a little bit more extravagant, is maybe the word, for the 10th anniversary, but that's what we got. We didn't really ponder on it for too long because we were just a few weeks out from Revenant, the second episode. Now, in a lot of ways, Revenant was naturally more important than Echoes because it no longer had a brand new expansion. Having said that, early sort of response to Revenant was actually reasonably good in the community, as far as I can remember it, in those first couple of weeks. Another big success story for Revenant was the dungeon, Vesper's Host, one of the best dungeons I think we've had personally. The tonic system and the story delivery was certainly under question from pretty much day one, but otherwise, things have gone pretty smoothly. But then there were a couple of more dramas, which included Waitgate, or the perk RNG bug in the game, which was limiting certain potential perk rolls from ever actually dropping. There was a bit of back and forth between the community and Bungie as to whether it was even happening initially, but the community essentially won that battle because eventually when Bungie looked into it with a lot of data that the community had actually provided, after spending some resources investigating, they discovered there indeed was a glitch with weapon perks. So community ultimately got the win on that one, and Bungie subsequently gave us some very juicy rolls of specific weapons for free. Leading on from some of the frustration associated with that though, we head into Act 2 of Revenant, where we got Tomb of Elders. Now, as I've discussed recently, obviously, when you mention something like Prison of Elders, there's a lot of direct nostalgia for Destiny 1. And Bungie actually did a pretty cool job of designing an activity for an act of an episode in the Tomb of Elders. There's a lot of stuff that does pretty nicely in terms of gameplay, but there was a significant amount of disappointment around the rewards for Tomb of Elders. Especially because I think Bungie had sort of leaned into a little bit of nostalgia by calling it that in the first place and it having that theme, but it added 2 more weapons from the Scorn set of weapons that we have for Revenant, and nothing else that's sort of new or unique outside of those, which is one of the biggest failures for episode Revenant overall, I think. Around the same time, we got the arrival of Festival of the Lost, but a lot of bugs have been happening in the game around this period of time as well, especially leading up to the Dawning most recently, where half of the event seemingly just didn't even work when it went live, which has sort of led us slowly but surely to the point that we're at now. But community sentiment, some of it's fatigue, there's a little bit of boredom there, but also that's being combined with frustration around the way Bungie have been handling stuff, and the quality bar and the quality of the game overall. And I think there's no single big thing that's brought the community to a more negative place, but it's kind of an amalgamation of things that have happened, especially I would say in the last 6 months, right? So it's really interesting to contrast how Bungie have performed, how the perception around the game has changed, right, in relatively short periods of time. The middle of the year, especially from April through until around about September, Bungie had an incredibly strong run. But when you look at all of the updates, the things they've done with the game, some of it really, really good, some of it not so good, obviously. It's quite remarkable just how much has actually taken place in 2024 when we talk about Destiny. But now we look to 2025, right, and I think Bungie have got certainly a challenge ahead of them as we go into a new model with 2 expansions, albeit them much smaller than something like Final Shape. Bungie also tried to ease some nerves right at the end of the year with a developer update, which indicates that lots of the content for Apollo, the first expansion, which will drop in the summer of 2025, is now nearing completion. But that's really where it's going to get interesting, right? There's another episode dropping right at the start of 2025. With Heresy, expectations for that are pretty high. But given the reduction in workforce at Bungie, I wouldn't anticipate that as we lead up to Apollo, we're going to get the same level of updates as what we saw in 2024, right? I'm not expecting an Into the Light 2.0, so still, there's a lot of uncertainty in the months to come, and I think that plays a big part with how the community feels overall. But it's been one hell of a ride. Guys, let us know what your standout moments from 2024 have been, what frustrates you the most, what you've enjoyed the most, what you're most excited for in the future, or indeed concerned about. I'd love to get your general thoughts overall down in the comments section. But if you're still here, I appreciate you tuning in today. Quite an interesting discussion, I guess. And as I've said previously, I'm in for the ride, at least into the next few months, and we'll see just how Bungie get on with this new expansion model. Other announcements on other projects, Marathon. At the very least, 2025 will be filled with discussion and news around the game, so I want to see this out for sure, see how things pan out through the next little while. For now though, as we approach the end of the year, all the best guys. If I don't catch you before the end of the year, then happy holidays. Have a great 2025 and I'll hopefully catch you there. Otherwise, I hope you guys have an awesome day.